She watched her husband abandon her and their 3 young children in an isolated forest shed with no food, no water, and no way out. But when she found a locked metal box hidden in that shed, she uncovered a secret that explained everything and gave her the weapon she needed to fight back. Where in the world are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. And if stories of survival, hidden treasure, and mothers who refuse to give up inspire you, smash that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is absolutely extraordinary. The last thing Thomas Brennan said to his wife before he drove away was, "You'll be fine here for a few days. I'll come back when I figure things out." It was a lie, and deep down, Catherine Brennan knew it. She stood in the doorway of the dilapidated forest shed, watching the taillights of their old pickup truck disappear down the overgrown logging road, her 3 children clinging to her legs. 8-year-old Emma, 5-year-old Michael, and 3-year-old Sophie looked up at their mother with confusion and fear in their eyes. It was October 2019, in the dense forest of northern Maine, and the temperature was already dropping as evening approached. The shed, really more of an abandoned ranger station from the 1960s, was in terrible condition. The roof leaked in several places, the windows were mostly broken, and there was no electricity or running water. But it had 4 walls and a door, which was more than they'd had the night before when they'd slept in the truck. Thomas and Catherine's marriage had been deteriorating for 2 years, ever since Thomas lost his job at the paper mill. He'd started drinking heavily, became increasingly volatile, and burned through their savings on failed business schemes and bad bets. 3 months ago, they'd been evicted from their apartment in Bangor. Since then, they'd been living in their truck, moving from place to place, staying in rest areas and parking lots, with Catherine desperately trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the children. 2 days ago, Thomas had announced he'd found a place where they could stay, an old shed deep in the forest that he discovered while hunting years ago. He'd driven them for hours on increasingly rough roads until they reached this isolated structure, at least 10 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense Maine wilderness. "We can stay here while I figure out our next move," Thomas had said. "Nobody knows about this place. We won't be bothered." But Catherine had seen the look in his eyes, the same look he'd had before he disappeared for 3 days last month, the same look he got when he was planning to run from problems instead of facing them. She'd known something was wrong, but with 3 young children and nowhere else to go, what choice did she have but to trust that her husband would take care of them? Now, watching him drive away with most of their remaining supplies in the truck, leaving them with only a few bottles of water, some crackers, 2 thin blankets, and the clothes on their backs, Catherine realized a horrible truth. Thomas wasn't coming back. He'd brought them to the most isolated place he could find and abandoned them. "Mama, where's Daddy going?" Sophie asked, her voice small and frightened. Catherine swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She had to be strong for her children. "He'll be back soon, sweetie," she lied, pulling Sophie close. "Let's go inside and explore our new place, okay?" The interior of the shed was even worse than the exterior suggested. It was a single large room, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with a small attached storage closet. The floor was wooden and rotted in places. There was an old wood stove in the corner, rusted and probably non-functional. Debris covered most surfaces: leaves, dirt, animal droppings, broken equipment. A few pieces of ancient furniture remained: a collapsed cot, a broken chair, a metal cabinet with one door hanging off. "It's yucky," Michael pronounced, his nose wrinkled, "and it smells bad." He was right. The smell was a mixture of mildew, rot, and animal musk. Catherine's heart sank as she surveyed their situation. They had no food beyond the crackers, no clean water source nearby that she knew of, no heat, no way to call for help, and she had no idea exactly where they were. Thomas had taken so many turns on unmarked forest roads that she completely lost her sense of direction. The sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. October nights in northern Maine could get down to freezing. Catherine's mind raced through their options. She could try to walk back to civilization, but it would take hours, maybe days, and she had no idea which direction to go. The logging road they'd come in on branched and turned so many times that she'd be as likely to get more lost as to find help. And attempting that with 3 young children in the cold and dark would be extremely dangerous. Her phone was dead. Thomas had the only charging cable, and it was in the truck. Even if it were charged, There was no cell service this deep in the forest. She had no matches or lighter, so they couldn't start a fire even if the wood stove worked. They had no proper shelter from the cold beyond the thin blankets. "Okay," Catherine said aloud, forcing confidence into her voice. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to clean up a little space where we can sleep, and then we're going to have an indoor camping adventure. Won't that be fun?" Emma, the oldest, looked at her mother with eyes that were too knowing for an 8-year-old. "Mama, is Daddy coming back?" Catherine met her daughter's gaze and saw that Emma already knew the answer. Instead of lying again, she said quietly, "I don't know, honey, but what I do know is that I'm going to take care of you and your brother and sister. We'll be okay." Emma nodded slowly, then squared her small shoulders in a gesture that reminded Catherine painfully of her own mother, who had died when Catherine was 16. "I'll help," Emma said. "I'm the big sister. I can help." Fighting back tears, Catherine pulled Emma into a hug. "Yes, you can. Thank you, sweetheart." They spent the next hour before full darkness fell trying to make a corner of the shed more habitable. Catherine used her jacket to sweep debris off a section of floor that seemed solid. She laid out their 2 thin blankets to create a makeshift bed where the 4 of them could huddle together for warmth. She gave each child one of the crackers and a few sips of water, then ate nothing herself because she knew she needed to ration what little they had. As night fell completely, the forest came alive with sounds. Owls hooted, branches cracked, and strange animal calls echoed through the trees. The children huddled against Catherine, frightened by the darkness and the cold and the strangeness of it all. Sophie was crying softly. Michael kept asking when Daddy was coming back, and Emma was trying to be brave, but Catherine could feel her trembling. "Let's tell stories," Catherine suggested, desperate to distract them. "Emma, why don't you tell us about your favorite day ever?" As Emma began to talk about a trip to the beach they'd taken 2 years ago, before everything fell apart, Catherine's mind was racing. Tomorrow, she would need to find water. There had to be a stream or creek nearby. That's probably why the station had been built here originally. She needed to figure out if there was any food source, berries, nuts, anything edible in the forest. She'd need to make a plan for signaling if any planes or helicopters flew over. She'd need to keep her children warm, fed, hydrated, and calm until she could figure out how to get them out of this nightmare. But as the temperature continued to drop and her children's teeth began to chatter despite being pressed against her, Catherine felt despair threatening to overwhelm her. How could Thomas do this? How could he abandon his own children in the wilderness with no supplies and no way to survive? What kind of monster left his family to die? Catherine was so focused on these dark thoughts and on trying to keep her children warm that she didn't notice something important. The shed wasn't quite as abandoned as it appeared. In the storage closet, behind a stack of old equipment and covered in years of dust and debris, something waited. Something that would change everything. And deep in the floor of the main room, beneath the rotted boards and accumulated dirt of 6 decades, there was something else. Something hidden, something valuable, something that explained why Thomas had really brought them here before abandoning them. But Catherine wouldn't discover either of these things until morning. For now, she held her 3 children close, sang them lullabies until they finally fell into exhausted sleep, and tried to ignore her own fear and despair. She had no idea that their fight for survival would lead to discoveries that would not only save them, but would also expose a truth so shocking that it would make national headlines and change multiple lives forever. She had no idea that Thomas's abandonment, as cruel as it was, had actually placed them in the one location where the past and present would collide in extraordinary ways. All she knew was that she had to keep her children alive until morning, and then she'd figure out the next step, 1 hour at a time, 1 breath at a time. That's how survivors lived. And Catherine Brennan, pushed to her absolute limit, was about to discover reserves of strength, resourcefulness, and determination she never knew she possessed. The night was long and cold, but morning would bring revelations that no one, least of all Thomas, could have anticipated. Catherine didn't sleep. She couldn't. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and even with all 4 of them huddled together under the 2 thin blankets in Catherine's jacket, the cold was brutal. She kept her children pressed against her, her body curled around them, sharing what little warmth she had. Her mind alternated between despair, rage at Thomas, and desperate planning. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the broken windows, Catherine carefully extracted herself from the sleeping pile of children and stood up, her body aching from cold and from holding one position all night. She needed to start figuring out how they would survive. Water was the first priority. Without water, they'd last only days, especially the children. Food was important but secondary. Humans could survive weeks without food, but only days without water. She walked quietly to the door and stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air. The forest was beautiful in the early light. She had to admit, tall pines and birches, the ground covered in fallen leaves, a light mist hanging between the trees. It was also completely isolated. She couldn't see any signs of civilization in any direction, just endless forest. Catherine's heart sank. But then she heard it, the sound of running water, faint but unmistakable. There was a stream nearby. She walked quickly back into the shed to check on the children. All three were still sleeping, exhausted from yesterday's stress. And then she ventured out, following the sound of water. About 100 yards from the shed, through dense undergrowth, she found it, a clear stream, maybe 6 feet wide, running over rocks and fallen logs. Catherine nearly cried with relief. She cupped her hands and brought the cold water to her lips. It tasted clean, though she knew there was risk drinking directly from any wilderness water source. But risk of giardia or other waterborne illness was better than certain death from dehydration. She drank deeply, then stood up and looked around, trying to memorize the route back to the shed. She noticed something else. Berry bushes along the stream bank. Most had already been picked clean by wildlife, but she found a few late-season blackberries still clinging to the branches. She ate a couple immediately, the sweetness exploding on her tongue, then carefully picked every berry she could find, maybe 24 in total. It wasn't much, but it was something. As she made her way back to the shed, Catherine's mind was working on survival priorities. Water, solved, though she needed containers to carry it. Food, berry bushes, possibly edible plants, maybe fish in the stream if she could figure out how to catch them. Shelter. The shed provided walls and a roof, but they desperately needed a way to generate heat. Fire, critical, but she had no way to start one. Her thoughts were interrupted by Sophie's crying. Catherine hurried back into the shed to find all three children awake, cold, hungry, and scared. "Mama, I'm hungry," Michael said, "and I'm cold. Can we go home now?" "Soon, baby," Catherine said, distributing the blackberries. 5 for each child, 5 for herself. "I found a stream with fresh water and some berries. We're going to be okay." "This isn't enough," Emma said quietly, looking at the 5 small berries in her hand. "I know, sweetie," Catherine admitted, "but it's a start. I'm going to figure out how to get more food and how to keep us warm. I promise." After the children ate their meager breakfast, Catherine took them to the stream so they could drink. She showed them how to cup their hands and drink directly from the flowing water. Michael and Sophie thought it was an adventure, playing in the cold water and looking for interesting rocks. Emma helped her mother search for more berries, but they found only a few. As they walked back to the shed, Emma suddenly grabbed Catherine's arm. "Mama, look," she whispered, pointing. There, in the soft earth near the shed, were clear impressions. Boot prints, much larger than any of theirs. Fresh prints, crossing back and forth near the shed's entrance. Catherine's breath caught. Someone else had been here recently. Very recently. Possibly even during the night. Her first instinct was fear. They were vulnerable, alone, with children. What if whoever had been here was dangerous? But then she thought, what if it was someone who could help? What if there were people living or working in this forest who could assist them? She examined the prints more carefully. They were large, probably men's size 11 or 12, and they seemed to circle the shed, as if someone had been inspecting it or looking for something. But the prints didn't go inside. Whoever it was had stayed outside. "Kids, I want you to stay close to me," Catherine said, trying to keep her voice calm. "There might be other people in these woods. If we see anyone, we'll call out for help. Okay?" Back inside the shed, Catherine began a more thorough inspection of their shelter, looking for anything that might be useful. She found some ancient cans of food in the metal cabinet, but they were so rusted and damaged that she didn't dare try to open them. Botulism was a real risk with damaged cans. She found some old rope, which might be useful. She found a rusty bucket that could hold water if she could clean it. And then Emma called out from the storage closet, "Mama, there's something back here." Catherine went to investigate. Behind a pile of broken equipment that she'd barely glanced at the night before, Emma had found something interesting. A heavy metal box, about the size of a briefcase, covered in dust and cobwebs. Catherine pulled it out into the light. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. "Should we open it?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Maybe there's something useful inside. Catherine looked at the box, at her daughter's hopeful face, and made a decision. She took a rock from outside and, after several attempts, managed to break the rusted lock. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now rotted and deteriorated, were several items. A waterproof journal, remarkably well preserved. Several old photographs. A bundle of letters tied with string. And most surprisingly, a detailed map of the area, hand-drawn, showing the shed and surrounding forest, with various locations marked and annotated. Catherine's hands trembled as she unfolded the map. This could be their salvation. If she could understand it, if the landmark still existed, she might be able to navigate them out of here. She studied it carefully. The shed was marked clearly in the center. A stream was marked running to the east that matched the water source she'd found. And most importantly, there was a notation. Main logging road, 8 miles northwest. Town of Millbrook, 15 miles following logging road north. 8 miles to a logging road. That was doable, even with children, if she could figure out the correct direction. 15 miles total to a town. It would take them most of a day, maybe longer with young children, but it was possible. But something else on the map caught her attention. A location marked about a quarter-mile south of the shed, with a notation that made her stomach turn. Cache site. Do not disturb. What was a cache site? And why was it marked on this map that had been sealed in a box in this shed? Catherine opened the journal, hoping for answers. The entries were dated from 1962, written in neat handwriting. June 15, 1962. Finally finished building the cache at the southern site. If everything goes according to plan, it will remain undisturbed for years, waiting for the right time. The shed provides perfect cover. No one would suspect anything here in the middle of nowhere. Robert says I'm paranoid, but I know I'm right to take these precautions. Catherine flipped through more pages, her confusion growing. The journal entries referenced the operation, maintaining secrecy, and protecting the assets, but never explicitly stated what the writer was talking about. Then she reached an entry that made everything click into focus. September 3rd, 1962. The job went better than expected. Total haul was $847,000 in cash and negotiable bonds. Robert and I split it 50-50 and cashed our portion separately. His cash is somewhere north. Mine is at the southern site near the shed. We agreed to wait at least 20 years before retrieving anything, to let the heat die down. If anything happens to one of us, this journal will guide the other. The shed is a landmark. Mark the cash trees with a special symbol only we would recognize. Catherine's eyes widened as understanding dawned. This was about a robbery. A big one from 1962, more than 50 years ago. Someone had stolen nearly $850,000 and buried their half of it somewhere near this shed. And somehow, impossibly, Thomas had known about it. That's why he'd brought them here. That's why he'd abandoned them at this specific location. He must have found some reference to this cache. Maybe he'd found this journal before and had memorized the location, or maybe he'd found another clue. He brought them here as a cover story, a reason to be in this isolated location. And then once he'd oriented himself, he'd left them here die while he went to dig up the buried money. Catherine felt sick. Thomas had literally used his family as human shields for his treasure hunt, then left them to die of exposure and starvation. But there was a dark irony in abandoning them here. He'd also left them with the very information that could save them, this map and journal. And perhaps there was even more. if that cash was still buried out there. And if Catherine could find it, they might have resources that could help their survival or at least prove Thomas's real intentions to authorities later. She looked at her 3 children, who were watching her with curious, trusting eyes. They had no idea what their father had really done, no idea the depths of his betrayal and selfishness. "Mama, what's in the book?" Michael asked. "It's a diary," Catherine said slowly, "from someone who used to work in this forest a long time ago. And it has a map that might help us find our way to town." She studied the map again, specifically the notations about the cache site. According to the journal, the cache was buried at the base of a distinctive group of 3 birch trees growing from a single root system, marked with a carved symbol. A quarter-mile south of the shed. Part of Catherine's mind said to forget about the cache, to focus entirely on getting her children to safety. But another part, the part that had been pushed to the edge of survival and had discovered a core of steel she didn't know she possessed, thought about the possibilities. If that money was still there, if she could find it, it could be evidence of Thomas's intentions. It could explain why he brought them here. And practically speaking, even old money might have value, might be exchangeable, might provide resources they desperately needed. But more pressingly, Catherine realized something. If Thomas knew about the cache, he would be coming back for it. Maybe not immediately. He'd probably gone to town first, to establish an alibi, to make it look like he'd also been abandoned or had gotten lost. But he would come back. And when he did, Catherine needed to be ready. She needed to either be gone with her children, or she needed leverage. The cache could be both, a bargaining chip if he returned, or resources if they managed to leave before he came back. Catherine made a decision. They would spend one more night in the shed while she figured out their exact location and planned their route out. During that day, she would also try to locate the cache. If she found it, she'd decide then what to do with it. She explained to the children that they were going to go on a nature scavenger hunt that afternoon. First, though, she needed to make their shelter more secure and comfortable. Using the rope she'd found, she hung the blankets across the broken windows to block some of the wind. She used a bucket to carry water from the stream, so they wouldn't have to make the trip as often. And she gathered pine boughs to create a slightly softer, more insulated sleeping area in their corner of the shed. While Catherine worked, she kept thinking about those boot prints. Someone had been here recently. Someone knew about this shed. Was it Thomas, coming back to check on them or look for the cache? Or was it someone else, maybe a hunter or hiker who could help them? And then, as she was carrying water back in the stream for the 3rd time, Catherine saw him. A man, probably in his 60s, standing at the edge of the tree line about 50 yards away, watching the shed. He was dressed in hunting gear, camouflage jacket, heavy boots, a rifle slung over his shoulder. When he saw Catherine had noticed him, he didn't run or hide. Instead, he raised one hand in a cautious wave. Catherine's heart pounded. This was either their salvation or a new danger. She set down the bucket and called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "Hello? We need help. My husband abandoned us here with no supplies." The man hesitated, then slowly walked closer, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. As he got near enough for Catherine to see his face clearly, she saw that he looked weathered but kind, his expression more concerned than threatening. "I've been watching the shed since yesterday," he called back. "Saw someone leave in a truck, then saw you and the kids come out this morning. Wasn't sure what was happening. You said your husband abandoned you." Catherine nodded, tears suddenly springing to her eyes at the relief of having someone, anyone, to talk to. 2 days ago. Brought us here. Left us with almost no supplies. Drove away. We have 3 young children, and no way out. The man's expression darkened. "That's a hell of a thing to do. Name's Walter Reed. I live about 3 miles from here. Have a cabin where I spend hunting season. I know these woods well." He paused and added, "I also know about this shed, and I know what's buried near it." Catherine's breath caught. "You know about the cache?" Walter's eyebrows rose. "So that's what this is about. Your husband knew about the old robbery money." He shook his head in disgust. "Let me guess. He thought he'd bring you out here as cover, then abandon you while he looked for it." "That's exactly what he did," Catherine said. but I found a journal and map inside. I know where it's supposed to be buried." Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying Catherine's face. Then he made a decision. "Ma'am, we need to get you and those kids somewhere warm and safe. My cabin has heat, food, and a radio. We can call for help from there. Whatever your husband was planning, whatever's buried out here, it can wait. Getting your children to safety can't." Catherine felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I didn't know what we were going to do." "You were going to survive," Walter said simply. "I can see that in you. You're a fighter, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. Let's get your kids and get moving. We got about 3 hours of good daylight left, and I want to have you all safe and warm before dark." Walter's cabin was everything Catherine had desperately hoped for. Warm, stocked with food, and most importantly, it had a working radio. The 3-mile hike to the forest with 3 young children had been challenging, but Walter had been patient, carrying Sophie on his shoulders when she got tired, and keeping up a steady stream of conversation that distracted Michael and Emma from their fear and exhaustion. Once inside the cabin, Catherine felt like she could finally breathe. Walter immediately stoked the wood stove, producing blessed heat. He gave the children hot chocolate made from a mix. They drank it like it was the most delicious thing they'd ever tasted, and open cans of beef stew that he heated on the stove. While the children ate ravenously, Catherine explained the full situation to Walter. She showed him the journal and map she brought from the shed, and she told him everything about Thomas, the job loss, the drinking, the eviction, the weeks of living in their truck, and finally the abandonment. Walter listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing more troubled as the story went on. "I knew about the robbery," Walter said when Catherine finished. "Everyone around here over a certain age does. 1962, 2 men robbed a bank transport vehicle near Millbrook. Got away with close to $850,000. A fortune back then, still a lot of money now. The FBI investigated for years but never found the money or definitively identified the robbers, though they had suspects. The case went cold in the 70s. He paused, looking at the journal Catherine had placed on the table. "I never knew for sure where the money was hidden, but I always suspected it was somewhere in this forest. There are dozens of old logging camps and ranger stations out here, most long abandoned, perfect places to hide something you didn't want found. The journal says it was buried near the shed," Catherine said. "But I don't care about the money, Walter. I just want to get my children somewhere safe and make sure Thomas can't hurt them anymore." "Understandable," Walter agreed. "But here's the thing. If Thomas knows about that cash, he's going to come back for it. And if he's desperate enough to abandon his family in the wilderness, he's desperate enough to do other things that might be dangerous. We need to get ahead of this." Walter went to his radio and began making calls. The first was to the Maine State Police. Within 10 minutes, Catherine was speaking with a detective, explaining what had happened. The detective, a woman named Sarah Mills, was both sympathetic and appalled. "Ma'am, what your husband did could constitute multiple crimes. Abandonment, child endangerment, possibly attempted murder depending on how it's charged. We'll issue a warrant for his arrest immediately. Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" Catherine thought about it. "Probably Bangor. His brother lives there, and that's where we're from. He might go there to establish an alibi, claim that we got lost or that something happened to us." "We'll check there first," Detective Mills promised. "And Mrs. Brennan, I want you to know you and your children are safe now. We're going to make sure he can't hurt you anymore." After the call, Walter made sandwiches while Catherine helped her children clean up and settle in. Sophie and Michael fell asleep almost immediately on Walter's spare bed, exhausted from their ordeal. Emma stayed awake, sitting close to her mother, holding her hand. "Mama, is Daddy a bad man?" Emma asked quietly. Catherine struggled with how to answer. She didn't want to poison her children's relationship with their father, but she also couldn't lie about what he'd done. "Daddy made some very bad choices," she said carefully. "He's sick in some ways, the drinking, the way he handles problems, and he did something unforgivable by leaving us out here. Whether that makes him a bad man, or a sick man, or both, I don't know. What I do know is that we're going to be okay without him." Emma nodded slowly. I'm glad we found Mr. Walter. And Mama, you're really brave. You didn't give up even when it was scary. Catherine hugged her daughter close, tears threatening again. Neither did you, sweetheart. We're all brave. That's how we survived. That evening, after the children were all sleeping, Catherine and Walter sat by the stove, drinking coffee and talking. Walter shared his own story. He was a widower, his wife having died of cancer 5 years earlier. He'd been a logger in his younger years, then a hunting guide, and now he spent most of his time in these woods that he loved. I need to tell you something, Walter said finally. About that cash, about the money, I have a personal connection to it. Catherine looked up in surprise. What do you mean? My uncle was one of the FBI agents who investigated the robbery, Walter explained. He spent 10 years trying to solve it, trying to find the money and the men who took it. It became an obsession for him, cost him his marriage, ultimately his career when he wouldn't let it go. He died 15 years ago, still convinced the money was hidden somewhere in these forests. Walter pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed 2 men in suits standing next to an FBI vehicle. That's him on the left, Agent Robert Reed. The robbery and the mystery of where the money went haunted him his whole life. He believed one of the robbers was a former park ranger who knew these woods intimately, and that's why they never found the cash. He was probably right. Catherine looked at the photograph, then at Walter. So when you said you knew about the shed and the cash... I've been looking for it, off and on, for years, Walter admitted. Not for the money itself. At this point, it's historical evidence, and it would go to the FBI or the bank's insurance company. But for a closure, to solve the mystery that consumed my uncle, to prove he wasn't crazy for thinking it was out here. He looked at Catherine seriously. Your husband somehow got a lead on this. Maybe he found some old records. Maybe someone told him, I don't know. But he brought you and your kids out here to cover his own treasure hunting, then left you to die. That's unforgivable. But here's what I'm thinking. We can use this. Use it how? Catherine asked. If Thomas is coming back for the money, we could be ready for him, Walter said. We work with the police to set up surveillance. We catch him in the act of digging up stolen money. That adds federal charges to the state charges for abandonment. It ensures he goes to prison for a long time, and that he can never threaten you or your children again. Catherine considered this. Part of her just wanted to take her children and run, to never think about Thomas or this forest or buried money ever again. But Walter was right. If Thomas was still free, he might come after them, might try to take the children, might become dangerous. What would we need to do? She asked. First, we confirm the cash is actually there, Walter said. The Journal said a quarter-mile south of the shed, buried at a distinctive grouping of 3 birch trees. Tomorrow, if you're willing, we could go back to the shed, locate it, and verify it's still there. We don't dig it up. We just confirm its location. Then we contact the FBI and the state police, and they set up surveillance. When Thomas comes back, they catch him. Catherine thought about her children, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She thought about Thomas, who had proven himself capable of monstrous acts. She thought about the future they'd need to build, free from his violence and chaos. Let's do it, she decided. Let's find the cash and make sure he pays for what he did to us. The next morning, Catherine left her children in the care of Walter's neighbor, Betty Thompson, a kind woman in her 70s who lived a mile away and who had immediately agreed to help when Walter called. Catherine and Walter then hiked back to the shed, this time armed with the map, the journal, and a GPS device, so they could mark exact locations. They also brought shovels, just in case. The forest looked different in full daylight, less menacing and more beautiful. Catherine could almost appreciate it now, that she wasn't desperately fighting for survival. They reached the shed by mid-morning, and Walter carefully studied the map and journal entries. Quarter-mile south, he said, checking his compass. Looking for 3 birch trees growing from a single root system with a carved symbol. The journal says the symbol looks like 3 interlocking triangles. They headed south, moving slowly, examining every birch tree they encountered. It took nearly an hour of searching, but finally Walter called out, "Here! I think this is it." Catherine hurried over. There, in a small clearing, stood 3 birch trees growing so close together that they appeared to be a single tree at the base before splitting into 3 distinct trunks about 4 feet up. And there, carved into the bark of the central trunk, now partially grown over but still visible, was a symbol, 3 interlocking triangles. "This is it," Walter breathed. "After all these years, this is actually it." He marked the location on his GPS, taking multiple photographs. Then he looked at Catherine. "Want to see if it's still there?" They began to dig at the base of the tree grouping, exactly where the journal indicated, about 3 feet down. Their shovels hit something that wasn't earth or rock, something wrapped in waterproof canvas, remarkably well-preserved despite being buried for over 50 years. "Oh my God," Catherine whispered. "It's real. It's actually here." They carefully excavated the package. It was large, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, and heavy. They pulled it out, and Walter carefully cut away the outer layer of canvas, revealing a metal box similar to the one that had contained the journal. The box was locked, but the lock was old. Walter broke it with a rock, just as Catherine had broken the other lock. Inside were stacks and stacks of cash, old bills, still remarkably well preserved, and what looked like bonds and negotiable securities. Even accounting for age and possible issues with old currency, this was clearly a substantial amount of money. "My uncle was right," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. He spent his whole life looking for this. And he was right. It was here all along. Catherine stared at the money, thinking about what it represented. A crime from 60 years ago. A mystery that had consumed an FBI agent's life. And now, the bait that would catch her husband and ensure her children's safety. "We need to contact the FBI," she said. "And we need to set up surveillance. Because Thomas is coming for this. And when he does, we'll be ready." They carefully reburied the box, marked the location precisely on GPS, and hiked back to Walter's cabin. By that afternoon, FBI Special Agent Mark Torres had arrived from Bangor, along with Detective Mills from the state police. Catherine and Walter told them everything, showed them the journal and map, provided the GPS coordinates, and explained Thomas's likely plan. "This is remarkable," Agent Torres said, examining the journal. "The Millbrook robbery has been one of our cold cases for decades. If that cash is where you say it is, you've just solved a 57-year-old mystery. But more importantly," Detective Mills added, "we can use this to catch Thomas Brennan. If he comes back for the money, we'll have him on federal and state charges. He'll go away for a very long time." Over the next 2 days, a complex operation was set up. FBI agents and state police established hidden surveillance positions around both the shed and the cache site. They brought in equipment and specialists. They prepared to wait for as long as necessary. Catherine and her children stayed at Betty Thompson's house, safe and warm, while the trap was set. On the 3rd day, their patience was rewarded. Thomas Brennan returned to Forest, driving a rented SUV, carrying shovels and equipment. He went first to the shed, presumably to check if Catherine and the children were still there or to look for the journal and map. When he found the shed empty, he was captured on surveillance cameras, looking both relieved and frustrated. Then, using what appeared to be notes or a map he'd drawn from memory, he headed south into the forest. He was maybe 30 yards from the birch tree cache site when FBI agents emerged from concealment, weapons drawn, calling for him to freeze. Thomas tried to run. He actually tried to run through dense forest from trained federal agents. They caught him within 50 yards, tackled him to ground, and placed him under arrest. It was captured on body cameras and surveillance cameras. Thomas Brennan, covered in dirt, screaming about how the money was his, how he'd found it, how his stupid family had ruined everything by being found by that nosy old man in the woods. His own words, captured on camera, provided additional evidence of his intent and his callousness toward the family he'd abandoned. The arrest made national news. "Man abandons family to hunt for stolen money," the headlines read. The story had everything. A cold case solved, a dramatic rescue, children endangered, and a villain who tried to sacrifice his family for buried treasure. Catherine and her children's identities were kept confidential at Catherine's request, but the basic story became widely known. Thomas was charged with multiple federal crimes related to the robbery money. even though he hadn't stolen it originally. Attempting to steal already stolen money that was evidence in a federal case carried serious charges. He was also charged with child endangerment, reckless endangerment, and criminal abandonment under Maine state law. His lawyer tried to argue that Thomas had always planned to come back for his family, that he'd just gotten disoriented. But the surveillance footage of Thomas's reaction to finding the shed empty, relief not panic, undermined that defense. So did his own recorded words about his stupid family ruining everything. In a plea deal to avoid trial, Thomas agreed to a sentence of 12 years in federal prison followed by 5 years in state prison. He also permanently relinquished all parental rights to his children. The stolen money, or what remained of it after decades, was recovered and eventually split between the insurance company that covered the 1962 loss and Walter Reed, who received a substantial finder's fee from both the FBI and the insurance company for finally solving the cold case. Walter surprised everyone by immediately setting up a trust fund for Emma, Michael, and Sophie's education and future needs. Your mother saved your lives through courage and resourcefulness, Walter told the children when he formally presented the trust documents. And in the process, she helped solve a mystery and gave my uncle's life's work meaning. This is the least I can do. In the months following Thomas's arrest, Catherine's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined during those desperate hours in the forest shed. She and her children moved into a small but comfortable apartment in Bangor, paid for initially by a victim's assistance fund, and then by money Catherine earned from a job Walter helped to secure at a wilderness education nonprofit. The organization taught outdoor survival skills and wilderness safety, and Catherine, who'd learned through the worst possible experience what it meant to survive against the odds, turned out to be a natural instructor. You have authenticity, the program director told her during her interview. You've lived what you'll be teaching. That matters. Catherine started with basic courses: how to find water, how to build shelter, how to prioritize in survival situations. But she discovered she had a talent for teaching, especially for helping people understand the psychological aspects of survival. The fear, the despair, the moment when you have to choose between giving up and pushing forward. Her classes became popular, and within 6 months she'd been promoted to senior instructor. The children were resilient in the way that children can be, but they also carried scars for what their father had done. Emma, the oldest, struggled with trust issues and sometimes had nightmares about being abandoned. Michael developed separation anxiety and had difficulty being away from Catherine. Sophie, the youngest, seemed to have retained the least conscious memory of the ordeal, but would sometimes ask casually devastating questions like, "Mama, why did Daddy try to make us die in the woods?" Catherine got them all into therapy, good child psychologists who specialize in trauma, and slowly, with professional help and unlimited love and patience, they began to heal. Emma discovered she was good at art and started using drawing as a way to process her feelings. Michael found comfort in structure and routine, becoming almost obsessively organized in ways that helped him feel in control. Sophie attached herself to stuffed animals and would create elaborate scenarios where she rescued them from danger, clearly working through her own experience in the safe space of play. Walter became a regular presence in their lives, not as a replacement father figure, but as something equally valuable, a trusted friend and mentor. He took the children hiking in safe, well-marked trails, teaching them that the forest wasn't something to fear, but something to respect and understand. He taught them wilderness skills in a fun, non-threatening way: how to identify edible plants, how to read a compass, how to build a fire safely. Knowledge takes away fear, he told Catherine. If they understand the wilderness, if they have skills, it won't have power over them anymore. Catherine was grateful for Walter's involvement. Her own parents had died when she was young, and she'd grown up in foster care, part why she'd been so desperate to make her marriage work and create the stable family she'd never had. Walter's grandfatherly presence in her children's lives helped fill a void while also giving them a positive male role model after their father's ultimate betrayal. The media attention around the case eventually faded, but it left Catherine with something unexpected: opportunities. She was invited to speak at conferences about wilderness survival, about single parenting under extreme stress, about recognizing domestic abuse patterns before they escalate to violence. Your husband didn't suddenly become the kind of person who could abandon his family, one domestic violence expert explained to Catherine during a consultation. There were warning signs: the drinking, the financial irresponsibility, the blame shifting, the increasingly erratic behavior. These things escalate over time. You did nothing wrong, but understanding the pattern can help others recognize it in their own situations before it reaches a crisis point. Catherine began sharing her story more publicly, not for attention, but because she realized it could help others. She spoke at women's shelters, at community centers, at programs for at-risk families. Her message was always the same: survival isn't just about physical endurance. It's about recognizing when a situation is dangerous and having the courage to leave, to ask for help, to protect yourself and your children even when it's hard. One of the most meaningful speaking engagements came about a year after the incident, when Catherine was invited to address a conference of family court judges and social workers. She spoke about the difficulty of leaving an abusive or dysfunctional relationship when you have children and no resources, about how the system often makes it harder rather than easier for women to escape dangerous situations, and about the importance of support networks. When my husband drove away, leaving us to die in that forest, I had nothing, Catherine said to the assembled group. No phone, no money, no supplies, no clear way out. But I also had something crucial that got me through: determination to save my children. And then, when Walter found us, a support network that didn't judge me for being in that situation, but instead helped me escape it. She continued, too often, women in dangerous relationships are judged for staying, for not seeing the warning signs, for not leaving sooner. But until you've been in that situation, broke with children, facing an uncertain future versus a familiar bad present, you can't understand how hard it is to leave. The system needs to make it easier, not harder. More resources, more support, less judgment. Her words resonated. Several judges and social workers approached her afterward, thanking her for her perspective and discussing how their own practices might need to change. One judge told her, "I've been hearing domestic cases for 15 years, and I realize now that I've sometimes been too quick to question why women stayed in bad situations rather than understanding the very real barriers they face to leaving. You've opened my eyes." As Catherine built this new life for herself and her children, she occasionally thought about Thomas in prison. She felt no sympathy for him. What he'd done was unforgivable, but she also no longer felt the burning rage she'd experienced in the first months after the abandonment. Mostly, she felt nothing. He'd made his choices. He was facing the consequences, and she and her children were moving forward without him. She did not take the children to visit him in prison, despite his occasional letters requesting it. Her therapist and the children's therapist all agreed the children needed to heal without their father's presence, at least for now. Maybe when they were adults, they could make their own choices about whether to have a relationship with him. But for now, protecting them from further harm was a priority. Emma, Michael, and Sophie knew their father was in prison. Catherine had explained it in age-appropriate terms. Daddy made very bad choices that hurt people, and when adults make choices like that, they have to go to a place called prison for a long time. We're safe now, and we're building a good life without him. The children seemed to accept this. Sometimes they'd ask questions. Michael once asked if Daddy would say he was sorry. Sophie asked if Daddy missed them. But mostly they seemed to have moved on, focusing on the stable, loving life Catherine was building for them. 2 years after the incident, something unexpected happened. Catherine received a letter from the adult daughter of one of the 1962 bank robbers. The woman, named Patricia Hawkins, had learned about the case through news coverage and had put together that her father, who died in a construction accident in 1967, had likely been one of the robbers. "I was only 7 when my father died," Patricia's letter read. "We always wondered where he'd gotten money for our house and for my education. He'd been a park ranger earning very little, yet suddenly we had financial security. After he died, my mother told me he'd made some investments that had paid off. Now I understand what really happened." Patricia's letter continued. "I want you to know that I in no way excuse what my father did. Stealing is wrong, and he should have faced justice for it. But I also want you to know that the money he stole, his half of the robbery, gave me opportunities one never would have had otherwise. I was able to go to college, to become a teacher, to build a good life. That doesn't justify the crime, but it does mean something complex came from it." Patricia asked if she could meet Catherine to talk about the strange way their lives had intersected, Patricia's father had stolen the money and hidden half of it near that shed, and decades later, that crime had nearly cost Catherine and her children their lives, but it also provided the means to catch Thomas and ensure their safety. Catherine agreed to meet, curious about this connection. They met at a coffee shop in Bangor. Two women whose lives have been touched by the same long-ago crime in very different ways. Patricia turned out to be a thoughtful woman in her early 60s, a recently retired teacher, who brought photographs of her father in his park ranger uniform. This was taken in 1961, Patricia said, showing Catherine a picture of a handsome young man standing in front of a ranger station that looked very similar to the shed where Catherine had been abandoned a year before the robbery. I look at this photo and I try to understand how he went from this, an honest park ranger doing his job, to someone who would commit a serious crime. Maybe he was desperate, Catherine suggested. Maybe he had reasons we don't know about. That doesn't excuse it, but people do terrible things when they feel they have no options. Like your husband, Patricia said gently. Except my father hurt nameless victims. The bank, the insurance company, whoever was transporting that money. Your husband hurt his own children. I'm not sure which is worse. They talked for 2 hours. Two women try and make sense of how a crime committed in 1962 had reached forward through decades to affect both their lives in profound ways. Before they parted, Patricia gave Catherine something, a small watercolor painting. I painted this, Patricia said. It's those 3 birch trees where my father buried his share of the money. I went there with the FBI after everything came out. I wanted to see the place. It's actually beautiful in a strange way. Those trees growing together, surviving for decades, holding this secret. The painting showed the birch trees in dappled sunlight, surrounded by forest. It was lovely, and Catherine found herself oddly moved by it. I'll hang this in my office, Catherine said, as a reminder of survival and secrets and how the past reaches forward to touch the present. They parted as friends, promising to stay in touch. And Catherine did hang the painting in her office at the Wilderness Education Center, where it prompted many conversations with students and colleagues about the strange interconnectedness of events, about how small choices ripple forward through time, about survival and redemption. By the time the 3rd anniversary of the abandonment arrived, Catherine and her children had built a life that felt stable and hopeful. Emma was 11 now, thriving in school and talking about maybe becoming an art therapist someday. Michael was 8, had overcome most of the separation anxiety, and had discovered a love of reading that consumed him. Sophie was 6, starting 1st grade, outgoing and confident in ways that suggested she processed the early trauma and moved beyond it. Catherine had been promoted to Director of Education Programs at the Wilderness Center. She'd published an article about wilderness survival psychology in an outdoor education journal that had been widely shared. She'd even started dating. Cautiously, carefully, with clear boundaries and awareness of red flags, but with openness to possibility that not all men were like Thomas. Walter was still a constant in their lives, now 70 years old but still sharp and active. He'd taught Michael to fish and was teaching Emma wilderness photography. He'd taken Sophie on nature detective walks where they'd look for animal tracks and signs. He'd become, in every way that mattered, the children's grandfather. One evening, as Catherine was putting Sophie to bed, her youngest daughter said something that made Catherine's heart swell with relief and pride. "Mama, remember when Daddy left us in the forest and we were scared?" "I remember, sweetie," Catherine said, bracing herself for questions or fears. "Well, I was thinking," Sophie continued, "that was really bad and scary. But also we got to meet Mr. Walter, and you got your job teaching people, and Emma got good at art, and Michael reads all those books, and I love our apartment. So maybe bad things can turn into good things." Catherine kissed her daughter's forehead, marveling at the wisdom children could possess. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Bad things can turn into good things. Not because the bad things were okay, but because we chose to survive them and build something good afterward. That's what you teach people, right?" Sophie said, "How to survive and make good things." "Yes," Catherine said, "that's exactly what I teach." After Sophie fell asleep, Catherine stood in the doorway of her children's room, Emma reading in her bed, Michael already asleep with a book on his chest. Sophie curled up with her army of stuffed animals and felt something she hadn't felt in years: complete, uncomplicated gratitude. They'd survived. More than that, they'd thrived. The man who'd tried to destroy them for the sake of buried money was in prison. The children he'd abandoned were healthy and happy. And the woman he'd underestimated had discovered she was far stronger than anyone, including herself, had known. The forest shed where they'd nearly died was still there, slowly decaying back into the wilderness. Catherine occasionally thought about it when she was teaching wilderness survival courses. She'd tell her students a version of the story without identifying herself, using it as a lesson in resourcefulness and refusing to give up. The person who survived that situation, she'd tell her classes, did so because she prioritized correctly: water first, then shelter, then food. But also because she refused to believe that the situation was hopeless. Even in the darkest moments, she kept thinking, kept planning, kept fighting. That's the psychology of survival. You never give up, even when giving up will be easier. For years after the abandonment, Catherine received news that Thomas was appealing his sentence, claiming that his lawyer had provided inadequate defense and that the conditions of his plea deal had been coerced. Catherine's first reaction was fear. What if he somehow got released early? What if he came looking for them? But Detective Mills, who'd stayed in touch with Catherine over the years, assured her that the appeal had virtually no chance of success. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Mills explained during a phone call: the surveillance footage, his own recorded words, the pattern of abandonment. No judge is going to overturn that conviction or reduce that sentence. This is just a last-ditch attempt by a desperate man who's realized he's going to spend most of his remaining years in prison. Will I have to testify? Catherine asked, worried about facing Thomas in court. Unlikely, Mills said. This is about procedural issues, not about relitigating the facts. But even if you did have to testify, you'd be stronger than you think. You've proven that already. The appeal was indeed denied, and Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. The chapter was truly closed. Thomas would serve his full sentence, and by the time he was released, the children would be adults capable of making their own choices about whether to have any relationship with him. Catherine could focus entirely on the present and future rather than fearing the past catching up with them. That same year, Catherine made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She went back to school. She'd never finished college. She'd gotten pregnant with Emma at 20, dropped out to work and support her small family, and then everything had fallen apart. But now, with the children older and more independent, with Walter and Betty willing to help with childcare, with tuition assistance from her employer, she enrolled part-time at the University of Maine. Her major, psychology with a focus on trauma and resilience. I want to understand what happened to us from a scientific perspective, she explained to Walter when she told him about her decision. I want to understand the psychology of survival, of trauma recovery, of how people rebuild after devastating experiences. And I want to have the credentials to help others more effectively. Walter beamed with pride. Your children are going to grow up watching their mother pursue education while working full-time and raising them. That's a powerful example you're setting. The next 3 years were exhausting but fulfilling. Catherine would work at the Wilderness Education Center during the day, attend evening and online classes, study late into the night after the children were in bed, and somehow still maintain involvement in her children's lives. Emma entered high school and joined the art club. Michael discovered a passion for environmental science. Sophie became involved in theater and seemed to have inherited her mother's talent for storytelling. And through it all, Catherine showed them what determination and resilience looked like in practical, daily terms. Her thesis project focused on recovery patterns in families who'd experienced abandonment or betrayal by a parent. She interviewed dozens of families, always careful to protect their privacy, and identified common factors in successful recovery: consistent support systems, access to mental health care, economic stability, and perhaps most importantly, validation rather than judgment of their experiences. Society tends to blame victims of domestic abuse or family abandonment, Catherine wrote in her thesis. Questions like, why didn't you leave sooner? Or, why didn't you see the warning signs? Place responsibility on the victim rather than the perpetrator. This compounds the trauma and makes recovery more difficult. Families recover best when their experience is validated, when they're told What happened to you was wrong, and you survived something terrible, rather than being asked to explain or justify their own victimization. Her thesis was highly praised and later published in an academic journal, adding to Catherine's growing reputation as both a survivor and an expert in trauma recovery. By the time Catherine graduated with her bachelor's degree, walking across the stage in cap and gown while Emma, Michael, Sophie, and Walter cheered from the audience, she'd already been accepted into a master's program in clinical social work. "I'm going to become a licensed therapist," she told her children at her graduation celebration. "I'm going to help families who are going through what we went through." "Because you get it," Emma said, now 16 and remarkably insightful. "You understand from the inside, not just from textbooks." "Exactly," Catherine confirmed. The summer after her graduation, Catherine did something she'd been planning for months. She organized a camping trip for her family, Emma, Michael, and Sophie, back to the forest where they'd been abandoned. Walter thought she was crazy. "Catherine, are you sure? That place holds terrible memories. Why put the kids through revisiting it?" "Because I want them to see that we're not afraid of it anymore," Catherine explained. "I want them to understand that we survived, that we're stronger than what happened to us. And I want them to see that forest as beautiful wilderness rather than as the place where their father tried to kill them. We need to reclaim it." She discussed the plan with the children individually, making it clear that participation was entirely voluntary. Emma was hesitant but agreed. Michael was actually enthusiastic. His environmental science interests had made him curious about the ecosystem. Sophie, now 9, treated it like an adventure. They went in August, 7 years almost the day after the abandonment. Walter insisted on coming with them, bringing all his camping expertise and serving as a safety net in case anyone had a traumatic reaction. They hiked in on the old logging roads, set up a proper campsite near the stream where Catherine had found water all those years ago, and spent 3 days exploring the forest with completely different eyes. Catherine taught them wilderness skills: how to purify water, how to build a proper shelter, how to identify edible plants. Michael cataloged the wildlife they saw, filling a notebook with observations. Emma sketched the landscape, capturing the beauty Catherine wanted them to see. And Sophie, youngest and somehow most resilient, simply played in the forest like any child would, climbing rocks and collecting interesting leaves and chasing frogs in stream. On the second day, they visited the shed. It was even more dilapidated then. Catherine remembered 7 years of weather and neglect having taken their toll. The roof had partially collapsed, vegetation was growing up to floorboards, and it looked like what it was, an abandoned structure slowly being reclaimed by nature. "This is where we slept that first night," Catherine told her children, pointing to the corner where they'd huddled together. "I was so scared, but I was also determined that we would survive. And we did." Emma walked around the shed, looking at it with an artist's eye. "It's not scary," she said finally. "It's just sad and broken, like Daddy." "That's a good observation," Catherine said. "Yes, your father was broken, and instead of getting help or facing his problems, he made choices that hurt us. But we're not broken. We survived." They walked to the cache site. The 3 birch trees were still there, of course, though the FBI had obviously excavated and filled in the hole years ago. A small plaque had been installed by the Historical Society, marking it as a location where the 1962 Millbrook robbery money had been recovered. "It's weird that money was buried here for 50 years, Michael said, reading the plaque. "And nobody knew until Daddy brought us here. Everything connects in strange ways," Walter said. "A crime in 1962 led to your father's crime in 2019. But it also led to that crime being solved, to your father being caught, and ultimately to your family being safe. Life is full of these strange connections." That night, sitting around their campfire, safe, warm, well-fed, properly equipped, Catherine looked at her 3 children and felt a sense of completion. They'd come full circle. The place that had nearly destroyed them had been transformed into just another beautiful forest campground. The terror had been replaced with confidence. The helplessness had been replaced with knowledge and skills. "Thank you for bringing us here, Mama," Emma said, as if reading her mother's thoughts. "I thought I'd be scared, but I'm not. I'm just proud of us." "Me too," Michael added. "We survived something really bad, and now we're okay. That's cool. Sophie, practical as always, said, and now we know how to camp properly, with tents and sleeping bags and food and everything. They all laughed, the sound carrying to the dark forest. And in that moment, Catherine knew that they'd truly healed. The wound would always be there. You don't forget being abandoned to die, but it was a scar now, not an open injury. It was part of their story, but it didn't define them. When they returned to Bangor after the camping trip, Catherine found a message waiting. The parole board had contacted her because Thomas was eligible for early parole review after serving 7 years. The board wanted victim impact statements before making their decision. Catherine gathered her thoughts and wrote a detailed statement. She didn't focus on her own suffering or on demonizing Thomas. Instead, she focused on the children. Emma was 8, Michael was 5, and Sophie was 3 when her father drove away, leaving them to die in the wilderness. The trauma of that abandonment has shaped their childhoods in profound ways. Emma struggles with trust and has anxiety about people leaving. Michael developed OCD symptoms as a way of trying to control his environment. Sophie, though young, has nightmares and separation anxiety. All 3 have been in therapy for years. They have healed remarkably, but the scars remain. Thomas Brennan showed complete disregard for his children's lives, safety, and well-being. He chose money over his family. He chose his own interests over their survival. If he is released early, the message sent to these children would be devastating. Their father's crime against them wasn't serious enough to warrant a full sentence. I asked the board to deny early parole and require Thomas Brennan to serve his full sentence. My children deserve to reach adulthood before having to make decisions about whether to have any contact with the man who tried to kill them. Emma, Michael, and Sophie each wrote their own statements. With Catherine's help, Emma wrote, I don't remember my father as someone who loved me. I remember him as someone who yelled and scared us. And then I remember him driving away while we stood in the cold, leaving us with no food or water or way to get help. I'm in high school now. I have planned for college. I'm building a good life. I don't need him disrupting that. I'm not ready to face him, and maybe I never will be. Please don't make me deal with him before I'm ready. Michael wrote, My father left us to die because he wanted money. That's what I'll always remember about him. Not any good times, not any love, just that he valued money more than us. I'm doing okay now, but it took a long time. I don't think he should get out early. He made a choice to hurt us, and he should face the full consequences. Sophie, youngest and most direct, wrote, My father is a bad man who tried to hurt me and my family. I don't want him to get out of jail early. I want him to stay there until I'm grown up. Then maybe I'll decide if I want to see him, but not now, not while I'm still a kid. The parole board, after reviewing these statements along with reports from prison officials and Thomas's own appeal, denied early parole. Thomas would serve his full 17-year sentence. Catherine felt relief wash over her when she received the news. Her children would be adults. Emma would be 25, Michael 22, Sophie 20. Before their father was released, they'd have the maturity and autonomy to make their own decisions about any potential relationship with him, free from the vulnerability of childhood. And Catherine would have those years to continue building a stable, loving life for them, free from the threat of Thomas's presence. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd kept her children safe. She'd helped them heal. She'd turned their survival into something meaningful. And she'd proven to herself, to her children, and to anyone who heard their story, that strength isn't about never being broken. It's about putting yourself back together afterward, about refusing to let the worst thing that happened to you become the defining thing about you. The story that had begun with abandonment in a forest shed had become a story of resilience, recovery, and redemption, and it was still being written, one day at a time, by a mother and her 3 children who'd learned that survival was just the beginning. 10 years after the abandonment, Catherine Brennan stood in the office of the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, officially licensed as a clinical social worker specializing in family trauma and crisis intervention. The years of education, supervised practice, and examination had finally culminated in this moment. Her practice, which she opened in partnership with 2 other therapists, specialized in working with families affected by domestic abandonment, abuse, and crisis situations. Her unique perspective, as both a survivor and a professionally trained therapist, made her extraordinarily effective. Clients felt understood in ways that went beyond clinical empathy. Emma was now 18, graduating from high school with honors, and heading to college on a full scholarship to study art therapy. She'd grown into a thoughtful, talented young woman who'd channeled her early trauma into artistic expression. Her senior art project had been a series of paintings depicting survival and recovery, including one titled The Shed, that showed a dark structure being reclaimed by vibrant nature. "That's what happened to us," Emma explained. "The bad thing is still part of our history, but it doesn't control us anymore." Michael was 15, thriving in high school, and considering a career in environmental conservation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The forest that had nearly killed him had become his passion. "I want to help protect wilderness," he told Catherine. "The forest didn't hurt us. Dad did. The forest was just there being itself." Sophie was 13, involved in drama club and creative writing. She'd written a remarkably mature short story about a family surviving in the wilderness, fiction clearly drawn from her own experience. Walter, now 77, had moved to Bangor to be closer to the family. He remained the grandfather figure they'd never had otherwise, attending school events and hosting Sunday dinners. "You know what I think about when I look at you kids?" Walter said at one dinner. "I think about that day I found your mother, looking terrified but completely determined. I knew right then she was going to save you. And she did. But you also saved yourselves by being strong and brave." Patricia Hawkins, the daughter of the original bank robber, had become a valued friend. She'd written a book titled The Cache, a crime, a forest, and the families connected by both, that thoughtfully explored how criminal acts rippled through time. Catherine and her children were featured with their permission, with the final chapters focusing on their recovery. The book's publication brought renewed media attention, but this time the narrative was different. Not mother and children abandoned to die, but family survives and thrives after abandonment. Catherine used the platform to advocate for systemic change. "The question shouldn't be, 'How did you survive?'" she told interviewers. "It should be, 'How does society create systems that help families in crisis so survival isn't such a desperate struggle?'" Her advocacy led to an invitation to testify before the Maine state legislature about family services reform. Standing before legislators with her children and Walter in the audience, Catherine shared both her story and professional recommendations. "When my husband abandoned us, I had no resources and no options," she testified. "When I escaped, I found a support system that saved us. But that support was accidental, based on luck. It shouldn't be accidental. It should be systematic and accessible to everyone who needs it." Several of her recommendations were incorporated into legislation that passed later that year. Catherine had turned personal tragedy into systemic change. As Thomas's release date approached, the family discussed what contact, if any, each wanted with him. Emma was clear. "He's a stranger who hurt us. I have no interest in a relationship." Michael was uncertain. "Part of me is curious if he's changed, but I think I need to wait and see how I feel when the time comes." Sophie, surprisingly, was most open. "I barely remember him. If you want to meet after he gets out, I might talk to him once. But I wouldn't trust him, and he'd have to prove he's changed." Catherine supported each child's choice, making clear that whatever they decided was valid. For Emma's graduation, marking a decade since the abandonment, Catherine organized a celebration honoring everyone who helped them. 10 years ago, we were in the fight of our lives, Catherine said in a speech. "We survived because we're strong, but also because people like you stepped up. You gave us support without judgment, and we're paying it forward." Emma's going to be an art therapist. Michael wants to be a conservationist. Sophie wants to write stories that help people, and I'm working every day to help families in crisis. After the party, Walter said something that struck Catherine deeply. "The real miracle isn't that you survived. It's that you didn't let what happened make you bitter. You taught your kids courage, resilience, and how to turn pain into purpose. That's the real victory." That night, Catherine reread the 1962 journal entry. "Actions have consequences that reach further than we can see." She thought about her own actions now. Going back to school, becoming a therapist, sharing her story, advocating for change. All would ripple forward, affecting people she'd never meet. When Thomas was released in 2036 after serving his full sentence, he emerged to find his family had moved on completely. Emma was 35, a successful art therapist in Boston. Michael was 32, working for the National Park Service. Sophie was 30, a published author whose novels explored survival and family trauma. Catherine was 63, still practicing therapy and teaching wilderness survival. Thomas tried to contact them. Catherine met with him once, with a colleague present for safety. He was older, claiming to be reformed, wanting to apologize and rebuild relationships. Catherine listened politely, then said what needed to be said. "Thomas, I don't doubt you regret what you did, but regret doesn't erase harm. You abandoned your children to die so you could steal money. That's not something you come back from with an apology." She continued, "The children are adults. If they choose contact with you, that's their decision. But you gave up the right to be their father when you drove away. The consequences don't end because you've served your sentence." Thomas tried to argue, but Catherine was unmoved. "I hope you become a better person, but you'll have to demonstrate that to others, not to us. We've moved on. We've built lives without you, and we're better for it. Goodbye." Thomas left, and Catherine never saw him again. She heard he'd moved to another state, was working in construction, living quietly. He didn't contact the children again, perhaps finally understanding that some bridges cannot be rebuilt. Catherine was fine with that, not bitter, just finished. That chapter was closed. The story that mattered continued in the lives Catherine and her children built, in the families they helped, in the positive change that spread from their choices every day. The abandoned shed had become not a monument to betrayal, but a launching point for lives of meaning and purpose. The story wasn't about what Thomas had done to them. It was about what they had done for themselves and for others in all the years that followed.